Hello everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James, and on this channel I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, then please be sure to give this video a like, and to subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. And, by the way, happy Halloween! If you paid any attention to my channel over the past couple of years, then you should know by now that this is my favorite time of the year. I love everything to do with Halloween. The beautiful fall colors, the cool weather, pumpkins that can be turned into jack-o'-lanterns, and the spooky atmosphere that seems to inevitably come over us as it turns into October. Watching horror movies this month is one of my favorite pastimes, so last year I figured, why not make it and make the pastime have some intentionality to it? Why not rank horror movies that are part of some of the most iconic horror franchises out there? And so that's just what I've done. And I did that starting with the Halloween franchise last year, and it turned out to be an interesting, if pretty long, journey. Now this year I've decided to turn my attention to another beloved horror figure, Jason Vorhees. Now I'll be honest, out of the trifecta of slashers often associated with one another, that being Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, and Freddy Krueger, Jason was always my least favorite. I didn't really find a big, lumbering guy in a hockey mask intimidating, and I found myself underwhelmed with the first Friday the 13th entry when I finally watched it for the first time a couple years back. But, just for the sake of fairness, I still did want to give these movies a shake and see what they turned out to be like. And what were the results? Well, I'll admit, and you'll see this as I go into my individual thoughts on each movie here, the Friday franchise, sadly, isn't as interesting to discuss as the Halloween movies that I ranked last year. But I will also admit, on the more positive side of the coin, that there were some pleasant surprises in this series, especially in the later entries. This series might actually be a bit more consistent in quality than the Halloween franchise, for better and for worse. But I'll not waste any more time and begin my ranking of the Friday the 13th franchise. And just a couple quick notes. First of all, if you have not seen the Friday the 13th movies, then you should probably avoid this video unless you're not curious about them, because I am going to be spoiling every movie quite a bit. Also, I will not be including the movie Freddy vs. Jason in this ranking. I know some people out there do consider that to be a part of the Friday the 13th and the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, but I sort of consider that to be its own separate thing. If you were curious about where I were to rank that movie, if I was going to put it in this list, it would probably be somewhere in the middle, but it has been a while since I've seen that movie, so I couldn't say definitively for sure. But nevertheless, I am just going to be including movies that feature only Jason in them. So, let's get started with my ranking of the Friday the 13th series for this Halloween special. And as always, I'll get started with the worst film in the series. It's disappointing that the movie in the series with probably the coolest title also happens to be easily, in my opinion, the worst. And something frustrating about the movie is that the title is essentially clickbait. We don't actually get to see Jason in hell at any point. Instead, he doesn't actually get dragged there until the end of the movie's very underwhelming climax. Jason, as we've come to know him, isn't really in this movie that much either. At the beginning of the film, Jason has supposedly died, but of course, the movie finds an out-of-left-field reason to bring him back. The movie's reason is maybe the stupidest yet, and that's really saying something considering all the different ways these movies try to justify bringing Jason back. But here, apparently what has kept Jason alive all these years is some sort of parasite. His parasite will keep on infecting people until he can find a blood relative to fuse with and basically come back. It's just ridiculous, and it's hard to understand why Jason is killing random people who don't really have any connection to Crystal Lake at all. The characters in this one are terrible. Our main final girl turns out to be Jason's sister in a last-minute twist that just left me scratching my head. This was already a bad idea back when Halloween made Laurie Strode Michael's sister, so I'm not really sure why the Friday the 13th movies copied this particular piece of homework from them. The movie is attempting to build Creighton Duke up as an effortlessly cool bounty hunter, and while Stephen Williams is giving it his all in this performance, and this is really the only one in the movie with any effort put into it, the character still just doesn't work. I don't really expect compelling character work in the Friday the 13th movies. Honestly, if you're going to these movies looking for interesting characters, then you're barking up the wrong tree. But at least this movie could have had some cool kills in it, which a lot of the Friday movies, even the worst ones, do have at least some. But this one can't even do that right. They are utterly lame and lacking in any substance. The movie's visual effects are terrible. There's some particularly laughable ones in how Jason's parasite gets passed on that look just horribly outdated, and I don't think they would have even looked good in the time that they were done in. And this supposedly being the final Friday was a truly awful note for this series to end on. But of course, if you know, even that part of the title was a lie, because we did end up getting 2 more movies in this series after that. Everything about this is a disaster, and easily one of the worst horror movies I have ever seen. Once again, like the previous entry, this one's title is a bit misleading. Jason doesn't end up in Manhattan until the last 20 minutes or so of the movie, and he doesn't really take it in any way, shape, or form outside of chasing a couple of the main characters. Instead, the majority of this movie takes place on a boat. Now, coming off of 6 movies that took place in Camp Crystal Lake, I was actually open to the idea of Jason killing in a new location. And a boat seems like it would be an ideal, intense setting for a good slasher. But that is not at all the case here. This movie's biggest crime is, it is so boring. The ship's location isn't taken advantage of, as all the kills done on it feel very stock. The Friday movies have just had far more interesting kills in the past. Jason is drained of pretty much any personality he had started to show in the previous films, and is just a hulking killer. But that does thankfully change when we get to Manhattan. This part of the movie does tend to work and has some fun elements in it. I particularly love a part where a gang is trying to intimidate Jason, and he just sort of takes his mask off and shows them what he looks like underneath, and then they retreat, like, yeah, they don't want to mess with this guy. He doesn't even kill them, he just lets them sit back down. It's a funny little moment that I think did show some of Jason's more funny personality that he started to have in the later Friday movies. The film tries to make the final girl, Tamara, interesting by giving her a sort of weird connection to Jason, where she had something to do with encountering him in Crystal Lake, especially when he was a child, but it doesn't pay off outside of that very awkward flashback that doesn't really make you feel that she has any real intrinsic connection to Jason. And the way Jason dies in this movie is odd and left me very confused. Pretty much everything about this movie is underwhelming and poorly executed. If this movie had taken place more often in New York, or even entirely in New York, I think it may have fared better, because that location did have potential, as was shown in the last 20 minutes of the movie. But what we're really left with is a movie that left me not feeling really anything and for it, besides the fact that it's just sort of undeniably bad and not a very good watch. Credit where credit is due. This movie's premise sounded the stupidest out of any horror slasher I've ever seen. What if we put an iconic killer out of any context they're known for, and instead just put them at space, because why not at this point? After all, we are at the 10th entry in this franchise, might as well throw anything at the wall and see what sticks, right? And yeah, this movie is definitely stupid, but I have the smallest bit of appreciation that this movie at least knows it's stupid, and it actually managed to place itself above 2 entries where their concepts should have worked, but they just didn't. If you can turn your brain off while watching this movie, I could see someone having a fun time with it. But so much about this movie still, even when you do turn your brain off, is undeniably flawed. The writing is particularly bad here, with some lines and the way characters deliver them just making me very perplexed. It's also so weird to watch Jason try and stealth kill characters throughout this, when that has never been his style, and there's no reason for him to do so on the ship. The characters in this are caricatures, I think it's impossible to deny that, outside of the admittedly pretty solid final girl Rowan, played well by Lexi Doig. Lisa Ryder gives a very cliched interpretation of artificial intelligence that made my eyes roll right up to the ceiling. Peter Minson can be cool as Sergeant Brodsky and has a line that was intentionally funny and made me laugh out loud. Jason is killing him, stabbing him, and he says it'll take a lot more than that to kill me, and then he gets him again, and then he says, yeah, that'll do it, and then he dies. It's actually a pretty funny scene that I did enjoy. The spaceship is not visually interesting. This movie has some potentially okay ideas on what to do with Jason in space, but most of them just aren't executed very well, including cheesy usages of virtual reality that had me putting my head in my hands out of frustration. I do appreciate the self-awareness this movie has, but I don't think it's enough of it, and I don't think it's enough to make the movie good. However, on a weird note, I didn't hate myself watching this as much as I thought I would, and what's even more surprising is that this movie ranked higher than a movie about Jason going to hell, supposedly, and one about him being in New York. This one should have been the worst, but somehow it wasn't, so I guess more credit there as well. I think it's mostly okay that Jason is made more supernatural in the later Friday movies because it makes sense for him, considering how inhuman his character already appears to be. I'm not so sure I'm a big fan of other characters getting to be supernatural besides him, though. In concept, I can see why this film decided to make its main character telekinetic. Without superpowers, it has been shown time and time again that it is almost impossible to beat Jason unless you've got your wits about you, and even then you're going to barely scrape by. So putting him up against someone who could naturally put up a fight could work. The biggest issue is that it's hard for me to buy into it when Tina Shepard does finally use her telekinetic powers against Jason. For a majority of the movie, she views her powers as a source of trauma. But at the same time, the final confrontation between them, it's hard to deny that it is exciting and cool. I mean, it is a lot of fun, and I think they actually do a pretty good job with the effects and making it feel realistic and having some weight to it. It's such a shame that the build-up to it is yawn-inducing. The worst crime that some of these lower-tier Friday movies have is that they are very boring with not super creative kills. There is one here, though, that was absolutely hilarious involving a party horn. I mean, it actually made me laugh out loud because of how cartoonish it was, but it worked. But other than that, the rest of them just left me shrugging my shoulders. All the characters here are tolerable, but besides Tina and the cartoonishly corrupt Dr. Cruz, none of them stand out for one reason or another. Jason's design is cool. I like the skeletal effects on his body. They push forward the zombie concepts that they were doing in Part 6, and I thought he looked great here, but I didn't find him to be very menacing. The new blood just overall is not great, and this one is probably the most forgettable to me in the franchise. At least for some of the bottom tier movies like Manhattan and Goes to Hell, I can remember some of the bad stuff in them for just how bad they were, but this one just left me not much to remember after I finished it. I want to commend this movie for taking a risk in that Jason technically isn't in the movie at all, outside of some visions that a traumatized Tommy Jarvis sees of him. And by the way, I do think Tommy Jarvis is the best character in the Friday franchise as a whole. I'm sure that's not a controversial take. I think a lot of people like Tommy the best, and I think there's a good reason for that. In some ways, this movie is almost back to the roots of the original Friday, as in the first one, the killer wasn't Jason either. But there's just some things about it that go against its favor. The biggest is that the movie tries too hard to convince you that Jason is in fact the one executing all these kills. It tries so hard to do this that it becomes increasingly obvious to anyone who can put two brain cells together that it's not Jason at all. The characters in this range from legitimately great to some of the worst characters I've had the displeasure of watching on screen. This version of Tommy Jarvis is probably my favorite in the Friday series. It legitimately feels like this is how he would act after having witnessed Jason as a kid, and especially after having to kill him. John Shepard's excellent performance in this convinces you of it. I also really like both Juliette Cummins as Robin and Melanie Kinnaman as Pam. Shavar Ross also turns in a genuinely charming kid performance as Reggie. probably one of the most fun performances in the Friday series as a whole. Unfortunately, this is contrasted with some awful characters that are portrayed as the most bottom-of-the-barrel dumb country hicks with some terribly written dialogue. The cops in this movie are nondescript, which makes it more annoying when one of them turns out to actually be the killer. You could have at least had a more interesting character be a killer than the cops who you don't really know at all. This is a film full of contradictions, and because of that, it's hard to figure out where I lie about my feelings on it in the midst of that. I do appreciate movies, especially in horror franchises, that take a risk. This one almost feels like it could have been the Season of the Witch of this series, but unlike the Season of the Witch, I don't think the risks it takes are interesting enough, and the fact that it's still trying to attach itself so much to Jason makes the risks not pay off as much as I think the movie wanted them to. Now we start getting into the Friday movies that are generally okay, and be prepared for the okay section to last a bit. Unfortunately, the majority of this franchise just isn't particularly remarkable to me one way or the other. Despite that, it can be appreciated for sure how much the earlier franchise films had an impact on the industry. This goes for Friday the 13th Part 3, the one I'm talking about here as well. The first 3 Friday films practically helped invent the cliches of slasher movies. One thing I can certainly appreciate this movie for is it does its job well, but it can come across just a bit workmanlike. The process of it building up its tension and then the kills eventually occurring gets predictable after a while. The movie has a novelty in it that it is the first where we see Jason as we are familiar with him in the cultural lexicon. That's right, if you didn't know, Jason doesn't actually wear his hockey mask until movie 3. The characters here are unfortunately decidedly less interesting. In fact, I would say that this group of teenagers is the least compelling for me. There are some cool shots in this movie though, and I know that they were primarily made for the fact that this movie got released in 3D, but they stylistically make the film stand out. And I do think this is a very competently put together slasher, and you can start seeing some potential in Jason here with the hockey mask on. But I wish I'd liked it a little more than I, in reality, did. I was prepared to put this one lower on the list, as I am very hesitant about horror remakes, especially ones based on slashers. But to my surprise, this movie really wasn't that bad. Still, at the end of the day, it's mainly sort of okay. This movie has a big thing going for it, though, and this shouldn't be ignored. It probably has the most brutal Jason in the entire series. Part of this can be attributed to the movie being made in the late 2000s. Effects are better now, and audiences were wanting their horror slashers to be more violent than they used to be. This movie, funnily enough, does look pretty mild compared to slashers that we get nowadays, but it still works on a visceral level. I think we have some okay characters here too. Jared Padalecki brings some believable weight in the lead role, and I felt compelled by his journey to find his missing sister. Danielle Panabaker is generally solid here, and Travis Van Winkle is eerily believable as the slimy frat boy type. He is remarkably despicable, but I think he did well in playing that character, and he may have given the strongest performance here in some ways in terms of how I portrayed him. Like most Friday movies, the dialogue here can be very cringe, with the line, "Your tits are stupendous," making me laugh aloud in disbelief. Some characters talk to themselves in places where they shouldn't. Still, even in the midst of my criticisms, this movie was far better than I thought it would be, with the effective cold open being a major highlight. I know, I'm putting the original Friday the 13th not even within the top 3. And if you're an enthusiast of the Friday franchise, then you'll probably be upset that I didn't do that. But, to be honest, in some ways, I almost wanted to place this one lower. I'm sorry, I just didn't find this one to be a very engaging movie-watching experience initially. But after finishing it and after thinking about it more, I set aside my biases and looked at this film in context. This movie is undeniably important. Without it, a lot of horror we know now would not exist. Visually, it is very confident in what it is doing. Camp Crystal Lake feels like a real personality here. It does have the unfortunate addition of performances that feel at the most awkward and amateurish outside of Jason's mom. But speaking of Jason's mom, I had complicated feelings on her being the killer. It is obviously derivative of Psycho, but I think the movie knows that. So, in a roundabout way, it actually turns into a fun homage. Mrs. Voorhees has clear motivation for why she does what she does, and it makes her an intimidating presence knowing how many teenagers she's killed in the journey of getting revenge for camp counselors not watching Jason. It's interesting to look back on the relatively simple way this series started, and how disconnected from that it did eventually become. This may be the main reason I appreciate this one, especially in reflection. Its simplicity is its inherent charm. Even if I can't bring myself to love this movie, I can't deny that. Now we finally get to the films in the franchise that I can say with confidence I genuinely like. While Part 2 still doesn't have the Jason we are now familiar with, it's interesting to see it serve as a sort of origin story for him. He barely appears in the original Friday, so this is where we get to know him in some sort of capacity. Jason just wearing a bag on his head is both silly and genuinely creepy, especially since we only see one dead eye poking out. This movie has the benefit of feeling like a summer camp movie too. Crystal Lake feels like a lived-in place with the ensemble of campers featured, and the campfire story vibe the movie has brings a sense of fun to the occasion. The camp actually sort of feels like alive here, and I don't know if the camp really feels alive in a lot of the other Friday movies. This one also has a major plus in featuring my favorite final girl in Jenny. She uses her ingenuity to outsmart and take down Jason. And she even goes so far as to use Jason's mom's head that he, by the way, worships in this movie in a very twisted way. She uses it to impersonate his mom and deceive him. And it was a shocking but effective moment that got me engaged and rooting for her to survive. For a bit, this movie was the one to beat for me because of how many different interesting things it was trying to do and how it did push the Friday movies in an interesting direction. And while this movie isn't super scary, I do still think the tension worked well and the kills were solidly executed. When I look at a movie like this one, I can see why these films are considered important in the overall slasher conversation. Something that genuinely surprised me in this series was how well a couple of the far later entries in the series hold up. If you had asked me to make a prediction of what Friday films would top my list, I would have not put Part 6 up there, much less in the number 2 slot. But here we are now with that being exactly the case. Now, there's no denying that this movie has a ridiculous premise, but the important thing is that it buys into the fun of it and makes it work to great effect. Jason rises from the grave in decidedly gothic fashion, and he is more kill-hungry than ever before, especially for Tommy Jarvis, who originally killed him. Yeah, this movie also has the benefit of bringing the best character back once again in Tommy. While I prefer his interpretation in New Beginning more, the action hero, wisecracking, ladies' man Tommy Jarvis that we get here works for this movie's tone. Also, one just can't deny that Jason coming back as a zombie is a badass concept, and visually, he looks awesome. He is imposing here, and the shot of his eye when he wakes back up is iconic. This film also, for maybe the first time in the series, gives Jason a bit of a personality. He seems to actually enjoy the hunt in this film. I love that there's one person he kills in here just because he was annoyed by them. And it is very funny, the comedy works. And there's another even more memorable kill where he looks into a cabin window at a younger kid. The victim does not notice him, so he just spends some time watching them, and then follows them through the window as they're walking inside, and he walks outside, just sort of watching them and not even killing yet. And he's clearly relishing in the fact that they are none the wiser that he is there just looking at them. It's great stuff that had me smiling at the screen. I like that there's a more genuine sense of danger with a huge group of young kids hanging out at the camp. The camp counselors have to actually counsel. What a concept. And, what's more, it has weight to it. The more I think about this movie, the more I like it. And who knows, with repeat watchings, this one could eventually top my list. It is just such a fun time. I think it does have some legitimately scary moments that had me tensing up, and it feels like just a good slasher and a pleasant surprise for a late entry in a horror series. Now this film, Friday the 13th, the final chapter, this is one that I can call genuinely great, and think it can stand up against some other great horror movies. Would I consider it to be among my favorite horror movies of all time? No, not quite, but I could see myself returning to this one for years to come. See, outside of the first two Friday movies, I had never seen these films before. So despite how many rough to mediocre experiences I had watching these movies, I still found it rewarding because I got to see awesome pieces of horror like this one. I think the best word to describe this movie is cruel, and I mean that in multiple ways. The characters in this movie are horrible to each other. I wouldn't call anyone outside of Trish and a young Tommy Jarvis likable, and it's intentional here. The cruel nature of the teenagers is further reflected by the equally cruel and brutal kills done by the most merciless version of Jason we see in the whole franchise. Jason here, it feels like he was meant to be feared. I think when people think of Jason Vorhees and think of the slasher Jason Vorhees, this is the one I think that most clearly reflects him. I like the way Jason is portrayed in, for example, Part 6 or Friday the 13th Part 2, but I think this is the Jason that feels like the iconic one we've come to know and love. And there's something to be said for that being the case that he's present here. This movie felt like it meant it when it was called the final chapter, too. It pursued that title like it had something to prove. I also found it clever how this movie connected sex and death explicitly. The Friday the 13th movies definitely established the trope of these characters are having sex, and oh, this character is going to kill them. But here, the correlation of the characters having sex and death and dying as a result of their horniness feels purposeful. They all suffer the consequences of their horniness to some degree, whether directly or indirectly. The kills are all memorable, particularly the moment where Jason throws a body through a window just to intimidate Trish. It's a jump scare moment, and it works. The characters are memorable in the midst of their unlikable natures. No matter how hateable they are, you can't deny that a lot of them are memorable. But the real standouts here are Kimberly Beck as Trish Jarvis, and especially Corey Feldman as Tommy Jarvis, who might give the best performance in all the Friday the 13th movies combined. Trish's reactions to Jason feel incredibly believable, and Feldman's haunting turn in the end of this movie works wildly well. It is amazing how well he executed this as a child actor, and that should be commended and praised. If there's one Friday movie that I would recommend to watch, it would definitely be this one. You don't even have to watch the other Friday movies, because this one works very well on its own. It is sort of unfortunate that there had to be so many other Friday movies as this one, because if the series had gone out on this one, it would have been the strongest note possible to go out on. But still, this was a very fun entry in the franchise that, yeah, I can see myself returning to in October and future years, because this is a definitive Halloween movie. So yeah, those were my thoughts on the Friday the 13th franchise. Now, keep in mind that this is just my opinion. You may like the Friday series more than me, or you may like it less than me, and that's fine. And I'd be curious to know, what were your thoughts on the Friday franchise? What would your ranking be? Let me know in the comments down below. And once again, my name is James, and I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, then please leave a like on this video, and subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. Look forward to another movie ranking series next year for Halloween, another horror franchise, and next year I'm going to complete the trifecta of slashers and focus on Freddy Krueger, so be staying tuned for that next year. But until then, I will see you all in the next video, and happy Halloween!